They didn't even notice at first. Arteries, the sting, the quiet ache that came when your name faded from their daily rituals, like a song removed from a playlist they never really listened to. But even then, before your final withdrawal, something in you had already detached. The heart that once burned to be understood now beat behind glass. You watched their indifference like a scientist watching cells divide under a microscope. No emotion, just observation. Just the cold, silent confirmation of everything you'd always feared. They only noticed you when you stopped giving, and then you vanished. No warning, no explanation. You let the silence speak where your voice had once pleaded. You didn't beg them to notice, or cry in some final act of desperation. You just stopped appearing, and that disappearance wasn't absence. It was strategy. It was control. It was your rebirth. They called it sudden, but you'd been fading for months, little by little, piece by piece, like a soul evacuating its body while the world was too busy laughing to care. And when they finally looked up, you were already gone. They tried to rationalize it, told themselves you were just going through something. But the truth was heavier. You weren't broken. You weren't lost. You had become the thing they never prepared for. Indifferent. That was your revolution. Not rage, not revenge, but distance, surgical, complete and irreversible. You became a ghost they couldn't summon, a presence they could feel but never touch. You removed the oxygen from their atmosphere, and in that vacuum they started to unravel. What they never understood is that you weren't seeking closure. You were performing a psychological ritual, ancient, instinctive. You were severing the thread, snipping it with the precision of someone who had bled too long to waste another drop. Your silence was not passive. It was a scalpel. It cut cleaner than any scream ever could, and it left scars in places they're still pretending don't burn. Because without your gaze, they have no audience. Without your empathy, they have no mirror. And in the void you left behind, their sanity began to fray. They scroll through old messages now, looking for meaning in timestamps and punctuation marks, replaying your last words like a prophecy they misunderstood. But there's no code to break, no secret message, just the brutal finality of being erased by someone who once would have walked through fire just to be heard. They never realized your presence was a shield, that every day you stayed, you were absorbing impact, swallowing venom, protecting them from the consequence of their own behavior. When that shield dropped, the storm came, not from you, but from everything you had been holding back. Now your name lingers in rooms you've never entered, whispers it through the mouths of people who never deserved to say it. You didn't leave them with a wound. You left them with silence, and that silence echoes louder than any goodbye ever could.
They thought they were winning. Every smirk, every subtle dismissal, every time they made your voice feel smaller in the room, they mistook your stillness for surrender. But what they never understood was that you weren't fighting. You were watching, listening, taking inventory. While they played their petty games, casting shadows to confuse you, you stood beneath them like stone, unmoved, measuring the weight of their deception. You let them believe they were the architect. You let them believe they had the upper hand, but deep down you were etching their tactics into memory. Every manipulation, every emotional slight, every smile laced with poison. You learned their patterns the way ancient civilizations charted the stars, not for wonder but for survival. They fed you illusions and watched for your reaction, testing the elasticity of your empathy like children pulling wings off an insect. But you didn't break. You became silent steel. You studied their guiltless eyes and calculated how much of your kindness they thought they were entitled. You measured the coldness in their affection, the transactional weight behind their concern, the way they only loved you when it benefited them. Their comfort was built on your exhaustion, their peace on your restraint. There was a moment, quiet, forgettable to them, when you realized the game wasn't about truth. It was about control. They didn't want you to understand them. They wanted you to doubt yourself. That was the trick. The oldest one whispered just enough contradiction to make you question your own memory, call you too sensitive, too dramatic, suggest that your instincts were flawed, that your perceptions were shadows, not fact, and you, hungry for harmony, would hand them your clarity like a gift. But clarity is a weapon in the wrong hands, and one day you stopped giving it away. They noticed the change, even if they never spoke it aloud. The way your silence no longer bent under pressure, the way you stopped rushing to explain yourself. You still smiled, but it no longer reached your eyes. You still listened, but not to understand, to confirm. Something ancient had stirred inside you, a sleeping tactician, a spiritual scribe. You weren't walking away yet, but you had already left emotional, and they felt it, even if they couldn't name it. You became unpredictable. You didn't argue. You didn't beg. You started answering questions with questions. You let them reveal themselves with no prompt. You didn't expose their lies. You let them rot in their own inconsistencies. That, more than anything, disturbed them, because they weren't afraid of being wrong. They were afraid of not being seen. And suddenly your eyes no longer gave them that illusion of worth. You were done being the mirror. You were becoming the void, not passive, not broken, but still in the way a blade rests before it strikes. They thought they were playing a game, but the truth was darker. You were the test, and they failed long before you vanished. There wasn't a scream, there wasn't blood, there wasn't even a fight, just a shift, so subtle it could have been mistaken for stillness. But something inside you cracked, and the soundless rupture carried more violence than they will ever understand. It was the moment you stopped asking for clarity, the moment you looked at the people you once would have bled for and saw not kin, but chaos in human form. It wasn't one betrayal. It was the 1,000 paper cuts of condescension, of laughter at your pain disguised as jokes, of your trust being used like currency in a game you never agreed to play. They didn't notice it. How could they? You were too efficient at bleeding in silence, too disciplined in how you swallowed your question, too graceful in your disappointment. You were always the one who folded first, not out of weakness but mercy. And mercy, when misunderstood, turns to fuel for monsters. They mistook your restraint for submission, your silence for agreement, your loyalty for servitude. So they pushed, they pressed, they plucked the wings off the butterfly and laughed at how easily it stopped flying. What they never understood is that butterflies were never built to survive war, but you were. You didn't flinch that final time. You didn't even blink. Something in you went still, ancient, reptilian, surgical. A part of you that had been dormant for years stepped forward like an executioner behind velvet curtain. You watched them speak, not as people but as patterns, algorithms of ego, repetition, deflection. Their faces moved, but all you heard was static. All you saw was the entropy behind their words. You realized you had memorized their script long ago, and yet you kept pretending not to know the ending. Until now, the last straw wasn't dramatic. It never is. It was a sentence muttered without thought, a smirk at the wrong time, a failure to notice that your eyes had gone cold, that you had stopped reaching, stopped softening. You were no longer participating. You were observing, calculating what must be discarded to preserve the fragments of your soul, and in that decision there was no rage, only precision, a blade so sharp it didn't need to cut, only to be drawn. They never saw it. They were too distracted by their reflection in you to realize the mirror had turned to glass, and soon to sand. You stopped giving them reactions. You stopped giving them versions of yourself they hadn't earned. You stopped bleeding where there was no witness. That moment, quiet, uncelebrated, invisible, was the beginning of your disappearance. But in truth, it was your rebirth. The self that once begged to be seen had gone into hiding, and what rose in its place was not a mask, not a shield, but something older than survival, something forged in the cold, far reaches of emotional exile. You didn't decide to leave, you decided they had never arrived. And in that realization, you didn't become empty, you became free. You didn't leave with noise, you left with absence, a silence so precise it sliced clean than any goodbye ever could. One day you were there, subtly holding the chaos together, anchoring conversations, translating their cruelty into something almost tolerable. And then you weren't. No warning, no apology, just a void where you used to be. And they felt it like a collapse in gravity. At first they told themselves you'd come back, that you were just taking space, that you were still within orbit, watching, waiting. But as hours stretched into days, and days bled into the slow agony of weeks, their certainty began to decay. You weren't watching, you were gone. Not just from the room or the message threads or the call logs, but from the framework of their reality. You had become untraceable, a phantom, not because you faded, but because you withdrew your permission to be found. They searched for your footsteps in digital corridors, scrolled through your history like desperate archaeologists digging for proof of their own relevance. But every trace led to silence, and in that silence their thoughts began to fracture. They asked themselves questions they couldn't answer. Did you always see through them? Was everything they believed, every moment they thought they were superior, just a performance you allowed? The more they searched, the more your silence mocked. Not loud, not violent, just deliberate. You had become something they couldn't touch because you removed their access, not just to your time or your presence, but to the role they once played in your life. You dismantled the stage, burned the script, and walked away mid-act, leaving them delivering monologues to shadow. It wasn't revenge. It was precision, a controlled detonation of every psychological tether they had tied around you. And now they're left gripping empty strings, wondering why the puppet stopped dancing. But you didn't vanish. You evolved. You stopped justifying your presence. You stopped trading your empathy for approval. You understood what they couldn't, that your absence was your final language, and only the truly hollow failed to read it. They once fed on your reactions, your confusion, your pleading, your attempts to repair what they were slowly tearing down. But now, they scream into a silence that never replies. They burn with the madness of being ignored by the one they thought couldn't live without them. And maybe they don't say it out loud, not even to themselves, but they know what you became. You became a psychological event, a personal apocalypse dressed as distance. You were never theirs to break, but now they carry the splinters anyway. They see you in dreams, in strangers' faces, in the places you once shared. You're not there, but they can't escape you. That's the curse of losing someone who once listened with full presence and left with none. They underestimated the quiet ones, the ones who don't announce their exit, the ones who erase their footprints and walk out as if through walls. But you knew, you always knew, power doesn't shout. It disappears and lets the echo destroy what remains. They didn't notice it at first. The absence wasn't loud. It was surgical, clean, like a scalpel removed mid-operation. For a while they believed you'd return, that this was just another one of your episodes. But the silence didn't end, and when the silence stretched into weeks, then months, it began to suffocate them. They had always fed off your reactions, your concern, your explanations, your willingness to fix what they kept breaking. But now there was no mirror reflecting their image back to them, no witness to validate their performance. And in your silence, they were forced to meet the one thing they'd been avoiding all along: themselves. They began to unravel quietly. At first it was small, passive comments dropped into conversations, nervously checking your social media for signs of life, rewriting the narrative in their heads. But denial decays, and once the rot began, it didn't stop. The version of you that lived in their mind began to mutate. At first they missed you, then they resented you, then they feared you, because in their world, people don't just vanish, people orbit them. and you had become the black hole pulling their lives into an abyss they couldn't control. You were never the storm. You were the eye, the quiet center that kept their chaos contained. And now, with you gone, the winds turned inward. The stories they told others no longer held weight. You weren't around to challenge them, but you weren't there to confirm them either. You became a ghost, not of who you were, but of everything they tried to erase, and it haunted them in the worst way. Invisibly, their smiles cracked, the mask became heavier, rage simmered beneath every interaction. They couldn't decide if they wanted to resurrect you or destroy every memory that had your scent, but you were already gone, not just physically, psychologically, spiritually, and they felt it. They felt it in the eyes of people who used to admire them, in the subtle shifts of loyalty, in the way silence echoed louder than any confrontation. You hadn't just left, you had dismantled their ecosystem, removed the only variable they couldn't manipulate, yourself, and without you to triangulate, to gaslight, to bend, they began collapsing inward like stars that had lost their center of gravity. In their desperation, they reached out, not with apology, but with bait, hooks disguised as concern, traps wrapped in nostalgia, but you saw it for what it was. The final plays of a drowning psyche, grasping for the one soul that had always seen. And you, now forged in distance and clarity, didn't flinch. Your silence became scripture, your indifference, sacred. You had become what they could never be, whole without chaos. They will never say it out loud, not to anyone, maybe not even to themselves. But you took something with you, something they will spend the rest of their lives trying to recreate in others and never succeed, because it wasn't just your presence they needed. It was the reflection of themselves they once saw in your eyes before you looked away. They can't let you go, not really, not fully. You vanished, but your outline still stains their memory, like an afterimage burned into retinas staring too long at something divine or damning. You became a ghost they summoned in quiet moments they swore would bring them peace, but peace never came. Only static, only the slow unraveling of a mind trying to stitch itself together with threads it once cut in arrogance. They tell themselves you were ordinary, replaceable, a phase, but why then do they scroll through your old messages at 2:37 a.m., replaying your voice in the empty chambers of their skull like a forbidden chant? Why do they mimic your cadence in arguments with others, parroting wisdom they dismissed when it came from you? You see, it wasn't just your presence they consumed, it was your essence, your precision, your stillness in chaos. The way you saw through them with terrifying accuracy, that scared them, because you weren't reacting, you were recording, archiving, strategizing, and now you're gone. But the surveillance never ended. They try to recreate you, new names, new faces, new projections, but none of them speak in riddles that make sense only at 3 a.m. None of them carry silence like a weapon. None of them disappear without needing to be chased. You set a standard they can't admit was real, because to admit it would be to confess what they lost, not just a person, a mirror, one that didn't flatter, one that showed them everything raw, unfiltered, monstrous. You left, and with you, took the last accurate reflection of who they truly are. They've begun rewriting the story. Out loud they say you were cold, you changed, you abandoned them. But their eyes betray the script, their hands tremble when your name slips into the room. Your name isn't just a memory now, it's a curse, a trigger, a puzzle with no corners. They resent how calm you were when they thought you should have been breaking, how quiet you became when they expected noise, how you left nothing behind for them to burn. But the real haunting, it isn't what you did, it's what you didn't do. You didn't beg, you didn't explain, you didn't collapse under their chaos. That absence, that disciplined detachment, echoes louder than any goodbye ever could. They don't miss you, they miss the control they thought they had over you, the version of themselves they were only when they had your light to reflect. Now they sit in the dark with the truth. They were only someone, because you saw them. You became mythology in their personal hell, a riddle that no longer answers, a voice they can't summon, a shadow they can't kill. They check your profiles not to reconnect, but to confirm you still exist, to reassure themselves that the ghost is real. And every time they see you untouched, unfazed, flourishing in silence, they fracture a little more, because the haunting isn't you whispering in their ear. It's the realization that your silence was never emptiness. It was exile, strategic, final, divine. They thought you disappeared. They were wrong. You withdrew, not out of fear, but out of precision, like a blade pulled back before the strike, like an eclipse waiting to pass over the sun. You weren't running, you were reconstructing. In the silence they mistook for surrender, you were recalibrating everything. Your voice, your presence, your thresholds. You stopped reacting and started recording. Each betrayal filed away like evidence, each insult a coordinate. You weren't broken, you were becoming exact. They used to know how to reach you, with guilt, with confusion, with the subtle poison of conditional love. But now their tools don't work. Your system rejected the virus. The part of you that once longed to be understood is gone. Excavated, replaced by something older, something watchful. You don't beg for peace now, you impose it, not loudly, not violent, but with the sheer gravitational force of someone who no longer entertains dysfunction. You became a void to their chaos, and it terrified them, because your silence isn't absence, it's command. Once they danced in your empathy like a playground, kicked over boundaries like dust, laughed while you bled. But now they don't even know how to stand in the same room. Your energy has changed. It's colder, still, unreadable. You walk differently. Your eyes scan for patterns, not approval. You hear more in silence than you ever did in noise. You learned that survival isn't about endurance. It's about detachment, strategic, surgical, sacred. You started studying ancient things, not in books but in behavior. You watched the way predators wait. You felt the power in shadow. You realized there is wisdom in withholding, that being unavailable is a language, that mystery is a weapon, that not every attack deserves an answer. Some only deserve absence. You became that absence, not empty, but encrypted, and they don't know the code anymore. Now they linger where you used to be, hoping for a flicker, a crack, a moment of the old you returning. But what they don't understand is, you didn't just evolve, you erased the entry point, the version of you that tolerated half love, half truths and half efforts. That version is no longer accessible. You didn't change, you upgraded the operating system, and not everyone gets the update.
When they look into your eyes now, they see something unsettling. Not anger, not hatred, but a complete and total lack of need. And to people who once fed off your dependent, that is the ultimate threat, because they didn't just lose access to your time, they lost access to your vulnerability. They lost the power to shape how you see yourself. You became sovereign, not in crown and ceremony, but in decision. Every breath you take now is own, every step deliberate, every connection vetted. And while they spiral in search of closure, you don't even flinch, because evolution doesn't apologize. It doesn't explain. It arrived quietly, like the cold before winter, like a prophecy fulfilled. They still speak your name in rooms you'll never enter again, but not like they used to, not with ease, not with laughter. Now it drips from their tongues like a confession, like a warning. Some say you vanished, others know better. You withdrew, and in doing so you became something they could no longer define or control. You were not a storm that passed, you were the silence that came after, the kind that makes people hear things they buried, the kind that makes shadows shift even in daylight. When you left, they expected absence. What they didn't expect was the void to echo louder than your presence ever did. Every attempt to replace you exposed how irreplaceable you were. Every word spoken about you only deepened the silence you crafted. They rewrote history, but their voices shook when they did, because even they don't believe their own stories. You didn't just walk away. You became a psychological rupture, the kind they can't patch over with distractions or new victims, because you were not just a person to them, you were a mirror. And when you shattered that reflection by refusing to play your part, they were forced to see what they really are: hollow, loud, fragile. They needed your gaze to feel solid, and now they are vapor. There is no closure for them, because you gave them no ending. Only an unfinished sentence, only an empty hallway where your footsteps used to echo. They revisit the past like archaeologists desperate for artifacts of your attention. Old text, old photos, conversations they now read backwards, hoping for clues. They're not mourning you, they're mourning the version of themselves that only existed around you, the version you made tolerable without your energy to stabilize their madness. They spiral, slowly, quietly, desperately, but you are no longer tethered. You do not chase justice, you are the consequence. You speak through absence now, through boundaries forged in fire, through a presence so refined it no longer needs to be seen to be felt. You are the thing they cannot touch, not because you're hiding, but because you've transcended their reach. You outgrew the role they tried to cast you in, and burned the script. Somewhere in their mind, they still hear your silence. It knocks louder than words ever did. It haunts their decision. It stands at the edge of their joy, a reminder of what they lost, not by accident but by design. You became the proof that their control was always an illusion, that someone could see them fully, deeply, and still walk away, not broken, not bitter, just beyond them. They don't miss you. They miss the power they held when you needed. They miss the reflection of themselves you once allowed them to see. But the mirror is gone now, shattered into 1,000 truths they'll never be able to forget. And in every quiet moment, in every fragile relationship they try to build atop the wreckage, you are there, not as a ghost, as a reckoning.